3, 2, 1.
Buenos días desde Oklahoma a todos allá en Castellón. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person, but at least now we have these technologies and I can at least send you a video with my presentation. First of all, thanks a lot to the people who have organized the Congreso Internacional en Comunicación, Cambio Social y Sociedad Civil, and especially the people at the university, the Jaume and Eloisa. Thanks a lot for the invitation to participate. In this presentation, I would like to start with the concept of the margin to address the issue of communication for social change. I'm using the concept of the margin as a shortcut to speak of complex dynamics of power inequality, processes of asymmetrical access to material and symbolic resources shape differentiated and unequal access to the public sphere. In our societies, some communities have greater access to technologies as well as the necessary cultural capital to position their voices in their public sphere. Other communities struggle to empower their voices and position themselves in local, regional, and international public spheres. Here, I call these sides of struggle margins. And rather than an in-depth examination of power dynamics at the margins, I'm interested in exploring how specific media ecologies develop in these side of struggles. And in the rest of the presentation, I'm going to draw from different cases of research. Some of it is my own research, and some of it is research done by other communication and media scholars. First of all, I'm going to kind of divide these in 3 or 4 points. The first point is that at the margins, media exist in very different creatures. Media at the margins are positioned so otherwise that we cannot see them. At the margins, media have generally existed out of sight, rendered invisible by the glitter and excitement of media at the center. We've never had enough scholars, researchers, or policy makers paying attention to media at the margins. As a result, we tend to flatten media at the margins. We overgeneralize, overlooking key differences between distinct types of media. In the last 20 years, numerous terms have emerged to name media at the margins, including alternative media, community media, citizens media, grassroots media, autonomous media, indigenous media, pirate media, and many others. Debates around each of these terms, which one is more appropriate, which one is more theoretically sound, abound, and there is an explosion of theoretical arguments for and against each of these terms, attempting to privilege one over the other. I have been an active participant in these debates, and yet today I've come to think that we should shift gears. Media at the margins exist as a plurality. There are many different types of margins, and each margin produces a different type of media. So let's look at some examples. One example is the geographic margin, where citizens' media are used to speak the world in local terms. And I'm going to present here a couple of examples. So let's look at the example of Pasolini in Medellin. This is an audiovisual initiative located in the outskirts of the city of Medellin. This is a neighborhood that was plagued by different types of armed conflict coming from, first of all, the drug lords and their militias, and then guerrilla camps. Later, during the 90s and early 2000s, paramilitary militias recruited young people from these neighborhoods and instituted regimes of terror and armed conflict. In these neighborhoods, the main targets of all these armed groups were young males, to the point that the collective imaginary around the young male body was the only kind of interpretation of this male body was that of a thug or a warrior, someone who's with a weapon in the streets. So in this context, Pasolini and Medellin this initiative that offers training and access to video and film technologies to young people in these neighborhoods. What they say they're doing is to provide cameras instead of weapons. So let me show you or disrupting this collective imaginary with the notion of the camera as a replacement of the weapon. If you look at the logo of Pasolini in Medellin, you'll see that there are two hands. One of the hands is the hand of the gun, and the other hand comes to transform the gun. Kids playing around with their hands, pretending to be weapons. And the other hand comes to transform that gun into a camera. Let me show you just a little clip of a video where you see a little bit of the environment and how these male bodies that before had weapons are now the new image that, thanks to Pasolini and Medellin, is disrupting that collective imaginary with a camera in the hand of a young body instead of the weapon in the hand of the young bodies.
Bueno, vamos de nuevo. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, acción.
No nos es popular, sabiduría de la calle, tradición oral, 100% real, seguimos al corazón y al calor de la comunidad, fuerza de la razón, posible otro cuento, lo nuestro, la vivencia, lo popular, tradición oral, sabiduría de la calle, otras ideas, nuevas palabras, nuestras razones, condiciones. No nos es popular, sabiduría de la calle, tradición oral, 100% real, seguimos al corazón.
So, one of the leaders behind this initiative says, Pasolini in Medellin, in Pasolini in Medellin, we are like vultures flying in the periphery of what has been said, looking for stereotypes and established signifiers as carrion. So they interpret themselves as vultures that are looking for these already established notions of what a young man is all about, and then eating that stereotype as carrion. In this case of Pasolini and Medellin, I am theorizing that this type of media is performative media. In other words, it doesn't really matter what type of content is produced with the cameras, because just the action of male bodies with the cameras, carrying the cameras and using the cameras in this neighborhood is making things happen even before the first video is produced. I'm going to shift gears to a different example. This is the case of Zuccotti Park during Occupy, and this is a very different type of margin. This is at the center of the global north, a center of political power and economic power and technological power, and even within all these centers, these activists of Occupy saw themselves at the margin and unable to communicate with each other. The margin produced a very specific type of information need. During Occupy, the police in New York City forbade the use of any kind of loudspeaker or sound enhancement system in the park. And so the activists had to solve the problem, the very kind of informational problem of how to communicate with each other when there were sometimes more than 1,000 people in the plaza, and this is what they came up with.
What she said?
What she said?
What's that?
What's that?
The proposal?
The proposal?
Be written in paper. So we can see it.
So we can see it.
When we discuss. Whether or not.
To approve it.
How do we feel about that? Okay.
So this has been called the human microphone. And it has been used, it has traveled from one social movement to another. This is another very interesting aspect that I think is understudied, which is how communication and information and media use strategies travel from one social movement to a different social movement, from one type of activism, sometimes on one side of the planet, to another type of activism and another social movement on the other side of the planet. So this is a different type of margin, it's a different type of information and communication need, and it's a different type of strategy to solve that problem. Now let's move on to the University of Oklahoma, the Bible Belt, as it is part of the Bible Belt in the United States, a very conservative place where the legislature and lately the state Senate and the state Congress have developed a war against the reproductive rights of women, and especially access to safe abortion. So in this type of margin, my students in the Women and Gender Studies program at the University of Oklahoma, who are very progressive and who are very activist, and one of their main points in their activist agenda is to defend the reproductive rights of women in Oklahoma, and especially access to abortion. So this is a religious margin where my students use countercultural messages to fight their wars against the legislature, and in this case they're baking cookies in the shape of fetuses. And so you can see here a very different type of medium, much more kind of in sync with countercultural media at the belly of the beast of Oklahoma. By the way, one of those cookies is the map of Oklahoma, the one that it doesn't look like a fetus. So again, it needs its own access to technologies, its own access to creative strategies, and all this comes together to produce its own type of media. So what is happening in the field of scholars who are studying all these cases? And this is my second point. Everyone is trying to figure out how to theorize these cases of activist media, social movement media, citizens media, radical media. And so many different scholars are coming up with different vocabulary and terminology to speak about these. And here my main point is that if we want to develop a strong area of research into this type of media are the margins, which have to embrace complexity. Many different media scholars are trying to do just that, and so one of the concepts that I think we all have in common is the concept of media ecologies. We're leaving behind the studies of one medium, or like radio or video or photography or print media, because we're seeing that it's more a media ecology than just a single medium initiative. And so you have very different scholars coming up with their own terminology to talk about this complexity. McCurdy, for example, talks about a media environment. Cavada talks about a communication ecology. Sasha Constanza Schock talks about transmedia mobilization. Again, Constanza Schock talks about hyper-segmented and multimodal mediascapes, or Mattoni talks about repertoires of communication. I like the concept of media ecology, and I've been thinking about a media rhizome, or which is also the idea that in cases of social movements, you have you have activists working with many different types of media, from social media to traditional broadcasting media, to even pen and paper for signs or chalk on the pavement and cookies, etc. So it's almost like a media rhizome. There's another scholar whose research is very interesting, is Merlina Lim. She studies the use of media by social movements, such as what happened during the Arab Spring in Tunisia and in Egypt. And she comes up with the term hybrid networks because she realizes that, or what she finds in her field work, is that things happen when you have a very different network of different types of media. So you have alternative media working in tandem with mainstream media. You have people with their own individual media, such as their smartphone, or sometimes even their cell phone that is not a smartphone, and at the same time converging with community media, and those two converging with a platform like Twitter or YouTube, and then that platform is picked up by a radio station, and that eventually makes it into the international media, etc. So things happen on the basis of a hybrid network. Another approach is what these three researchers that wrote a fascinating book called Protest Camps, Feigenbaum, Frenzel, and McCurdy, and they talk about promiscuous media. And so in their analysis of protest camps, these authors propose the term promiscuous to explain how ideas and strategies travel and spread in multiple directions, in often cunning and seemingly chaotic processes of cross-pollination, adaptation, and hybridization, replication, etc. These authors warn against looking for linearity and large-scale structures in a process of social change, and suggest paying attention to microstructures and sometimes imperceptible processes that connect one movement to another across time and space. And this is what is very clearly happening, where you see activists in one social movement in one side of the globe solving a communication or information problem with one strategy, and then 3 or 4 or 5 years later you see that that same strategy traveled through kind of obscure and subtle channels to another side of the globe on a different social movement media. So sometimes I think that the scholarship is a little bit compulsive in its classifications. And so, for example, this is all classification models proposed by recent scholarship, where activist media practice is one of the concepts, and is divided in two: media knowledge and relational media practice. Another scholar proposes media uses divided in 3: strategic media uses, organizing media uses, and decision-making media uses. Yet another scholar talks about communication culture in social movements, and this is classified in all those terms that you see at the bottom of the slide. And so, as you can see, there's a lot of attempts to classify what activists and social movements and communities at the margins do with media technologies. When it comes to media, there's again somewhat compulsive classification. So media are divided into digital mainstream media, non-digital mainstream media, digital alternative, non-digital alternative, communication horizontals, communication verticals, all media, new media, participatory media, strategic media. In my view, I would like to propose that we stay away from such compulsive classification, because to me this is fragmenting the reality of media at the margins into little pieces, and I think we're missing the process by fragmenting reality into such little pieces. And so I would like to suggest that instead of focusing our research on the media and and how the communication process happened, we shift our focus to the communicator behind the technology. And I would like to illustrate this with a case that comes from my own research in a community radio station located in Magdalena Medio in Colombia. This community radio station is called Santa Rosa Estéreo, and it's a municipal radio station. So when I was doing my field research, I was told the story, one of the stories where my question was about, have you ever seen been a witness of this community radio station contributing to the construction of peace in the Magdalena Medio? And one of my respondents told me the story of a case where the guerrilla kidnapped the director of the radio station, of the community radio station. The community radio station director was a long-time community leader. He was a teacher at the school, one of these people who was very involved in the community in very different ways and plays different roles in kind of contributing to the community. Part of that work of this leader was being the director of the radio station. When the guerrilla kidnaps him and takes them to their camp, someone sees the kidnapping and they run to the radio station because they know that this person, the witness, knows that the kidnapped victim is the director of the radio station. So he ran to the small town and to the radio station and told them that the director had been kidnapped by the guerrilla. At the time, there's 3 or 4 people inside the radio station, and immediately they get together and it's like, what are we gonna do? And in this ad hoc moment of decision making, they decide that they're going to make this a public event. They're going to use the technology that they have in hand to make this a public event, an event that has impact the entire community and not just the family of Jose Botello, the director of the radio station. So they used the station to announce that what had happened. So they announced that the guerrilla has kidnapped Jose Botello and they have taken him away. Immediately, messages from the entire community come pouring in. Some of the messages are addressed to Jose Botello, the victim of the kidnapping. Some of the messages are addressed to the guerrilla, demanding that they respect the life and the rights of the civilian who is not part of any of the armed groups involved in the war in Colombia. And so the radio station, the people, the producers, the radio station again have to get together and decide, what are we going to do with all these messages? And again, they decide to broadcast the messages. And so they totally shift their programming to broadcasting and reading on the air each one of these messages that came to the radio station. A few hours later, there's a phone call to the radio station, and is the guerrilla asking or kind of challenging the radio station and saying, well, if this person is so well liked in the community, why don't they all come and get him? And again, the radio station producers decide to air this challenge of the guerrilla. And so what happens is that in 4 hours, people start volunteering to form a commission to go get Jose Botello to wherever the guerrilla is holding him hostage. And so my respondent drew this as an illustration of what happened, and he, in his narrative, 480 men and women from the town and the rural area around the town of Santa Rosa got together. They got every jeep, car, truck available. They store blankets and pots and pans and food because they had no idea how long this was going to take. And they caravan up the mountains towards the guerrilla camp. And they set up shop there, and they refused to leave unless the guerrilla is willing to release their leader. And so the guerrilla is kind of like in shock because, you know, almost 500 civilians have invaded the camp. And so the commandos at the guerrilla camp have to talk to the supervisors, and communication goes and comes. And finally, after 3 days, the guerrilla decides to release the leader. And so the caravan coming back down the mountains with Jose Botello, with the victim of the kidnap in one of the cars. So in this case, the communication and information needs were very specific. The armed group victimized the civilians in this town. The potential to resist this victimization existed in the community, but it was scattered. It was up to the radio producers at the community radio station to use communication to galvanize this potential into a collective voice capable of resisting the guerrillas' violent intrusion into the community. These community communicators had to step very carefully because they knew that any wrong move could put Botello's life at risk, but they were so deeply embedded in their local context that they knew how far they could push, how far the guerrilla was willing to go before the political cost of a violent act became too high. So in a series of impromptu decisions, they redirected the radio station, turning it into a hub of communication and information processes between members of the community, from the community to Botello, from the community to the guerrilla group, and from the community to the Colombian government. So my proposal is that we shift perspectives to focus on the communicator trying to figure out how to use media. And so if we do this, it becomes clear that at the margins, grassroots communicators exist in a media ecology or communication rhizosphere that offers different potentialities in each historical situation. What determines media use is not whether the technology is old or new, digital or not digital. What determines media use is a flux of historical information and communication needs, and how embedded community communicators employ available technologies to address these needs. In other words, I'm calling to shift from technologies into uses and needs, or the other way around. Needs, which communication and information needs appear in each case, and how the community communicators in each case of marginality employ whatever technology they have at hand, whatever skills and creativity they have at hand to kind of address these needs in very different ways in each case. So, in kind of bringing all this together, to conclude, understanding media at the margins is about focusing on historical contexts and understanding that each historical context is going to produce a different type of media, embracing complexity, maintaining the notion of a communication ecology or a communication rhizosphere, and looking at embedded local communicators and how they domesticate technology to address communication needs. Thank you.